Modern-day Cambodia, nearly 900 years ago. Angkor. The dry season, 1150 AD. I'm Arthur, and we're stepping into the largest pre-industrial city the world has ever known, Angkor. At its height, this city sprawls across an area larger than modern-day Los Angeles, home to perhaps 750,000 to 1 million people, scattered across a vast urban network of temples, reservoirs, and rice fields. Angkor Wat, the largest religious monument ever constructed by human hands, has just been completed. Canals stretch for hundreds of kilometers, engineered with a precision that wouldn't be matched in Southeast Asia for centuries. This is the capital of the Khmer Empire, a civilization that dominates Southeast Asia for over 400 years. But within 3 centuries, this magnificent city would be abandoned, swallowed whole by the jungle, its canals silted, its temples strangled by strangler figs, its very existence reduced to local legend, until French explorers rediscovered it in the 19th century. I've used modern AI to reconstruct Angkor at its 1150 peak, and during its long, quiet unraveling. We're going to walk its causeways, enter its greatest temples, and witness how the most sophisticated hydraulic city on Earth met a slow, creeping death that took nearly 2 centuries to complete. Angkor's story begins in 802 AD, when a king named Jayavarman II declared himself a Chakravartin, a universal monarch, and established the concept of the Devaraja, the God King, uniting a fractured region of competing Khmer principalities under a single divine authority. This wasn't just political consolidation, it was a religious revolution, fusing Hindu cosmology with local ancestor worship, positioning the king as a living conduit between the earthly realm and the mountain of the gods, Mount Meru. Every temple built afterward would, in some way, be an architectural echo of that cosmic mountain. Over the following 3 centuries, a succession of kings expanded the empire's territory, its irrigation systems, and its monumental architecture, each ruler seeking to outdo his predecessors with grander temples and more ambitious engineering projects. By 1150, under King Suryavarman II, Angkor had reached its zenith. The city's defining feature wasn't just its temples, it was water. The Khmer engineers had solved a problem that had plagued Southeast Asian civilizations for centuries: how to sustain a massive urban population through Cambodia's brutal monsoon cycle. 6 months of torrential rain followed by 6 months of near-total drought. Their solution was breathtaking in scale. 2 enormous reservoirs, called bares, anchored the city's water system. The West Bare alone stretched 8 kilometers long and 2 kilometers wide, an artificial lake larger than many natural ones, holding enough water to irrigate rice paddies through the dry season and buffer the city against monsoon flooding. Connected to these reservoirs was a network of canals, moats, and smaller ponds, stretching across a landscape covering, by modern satellite and LiDAR surveys, over 1,000 square kilometers, making Angkor not just a city with a water system, but arguably the most extensive hydraulic network of the pre-industrial world. This water network fed rice cultivation on a staggering scale, and rice was the true foundation of Khmer power. Modern archaeological surveys suggest Angkor's agricultural system could support harvests far beyond subsistence needs, likely enabling multiple rice crops per year in some areas. A surplus economy that freed enormous numbers of people from full-time farming to work as temple builders, soldiers, administrators, and artisans. Every great temple you see in the reconstructions around us existed only because Khmer engineers had mastered water first. Stone came second. And the stone they built with, at Angkor Wat specifically, is almost incomprehensible in scale. Commissioned by Suryavarman II in the early 12th century as his state temple and eventual mausoleum, Angkor Wat covers over 160 hectares, making it, by most measures, the largest religious monument ever constructed anywhere in the world. The temple complex is surrounded by a moat 190 meters wide, so vast that from certain angles, the entire structure appears to float on water, its 5 lotus bud towers mirrored perfectly in the surface below. You'd approach across a sandstone causeway spanning that moat, itself a feat of engineering, before passing through an outer wall enclosing an area larger than some medieval European cities in their entirety. Walk through the entrance gopura and you'd find yourself facing galleries of bas-relief carvings running for hundreds of meters, some of the most extensive stone carving programs ever undertaken by any civilization. One gallery depicts the Battle of Kurukshetra from the Hindu epic Mahabharata. Another shows Suryavarman II himself in royal procession, seated on an elaborate palanquin, surrounded by attendants and military commanders. Perhaps most famous is the Churning of the Sea of Milk, a nearly 50-meter-long relief depicting gods and demons cooperating and competing to churn the cosmic ocean in search of the elixir of immortality. Ropes made from a serpent king wound around the mountain Mandara, all rendered in astonishing anatomical detail across sandstone blocks quarried from Phnom Kulen, a mountain over 40 kilometers away. The stone itself tells its own logistical story. Angkor Wat alone required an estimated 5 to 10 million sandstone blocks, some weighing over 1.5 tons, transported via a combination of river barges along canals specifically engineered for this purpose, and overland hauling using elephants and manpower. Historians and engineers still debate the precise logistics, but the consensus is staggering regardless of exact method. This was construction on a scale that demanded coordinated labor, sophisticated project management, and an economic surplus large enough to sustain tens of thousands of workers, sculptors, and support staff for decades. Unlike the popular myth of slave-built monuments, evidence increasingly suggests much of this labor came from a mix of corvée duty, a rotational labor obligation owed to the king, alongside skilled artisans who received compensation and status for their craft. At the very center of Angkor Wat's innermost enclosure rises the central tower, reaching 65 meters above the ground, a height that made it, at completion, likely the tallest structure in Southeast Asia. Climbing the impossibly steep stairways to the upper terrace was deliberately difficult, a physical enactment of the spiritual difficulty in ascending toward the divine. From the summit, the view stretched across the entire temple complex, the surrounding moat, and beyond it, the vast urban sprawl of Angkor itself, dotted with smaller temples, canals catching the afternoon light, and the endless green geometry of rice paddies extending toward the horizon. But Angkor Wat, however monumental, was just one temple in a city containing hundreds. To the north stood Angkor Thom, the fortified royal city built later by King Jayavarman II, enclosed by walls stretching 12 kilometers in a square, each side punctuated by monumental gates topped with 4 enormous serene stone faces, gazing in the cardinal directions. Faces believed by many scholars to represent either the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara or a divine idealization of Jayavarman VII himself, blurring the line between king and god in stone. At Angkor Thom's center stood the Bayon, a temple whose defining feature is precisely this: 216 enormous serene faces carved into 54 towers, watching over the city from every angle. A psychological architecture designed to remind every resident, every visitor, every merchant passing through the gates that the god king's gaze was inescapable. Jayavarman VII, who ruled from roughly 1181 to 1218, represents perhaps the most ambitious builder in Khmer history, and his story is inseparable from a devastating setback that reshaped Angkor's trajectory. In 1177, Angkor had been sacked by the rival kingdom of Champa, whose naval forces sailed up the Tonle Sap and struck the Khmer capital directly, an event so traumatic it's memorialized in later bas-reliefs showing naval battles on the lake. Jayavarman VII, then a prince, eventually reclaimed the throne and, rather than simply rebuilding what existed, embarked on the most intensive building campaign in Khmer history, partly driven by a newly adopted Mahayana Buddhist faith that emphasized public works, hospitals, and infrastructure as expressions of royal compassion. Under his reign, an estimated 102 hospitals were constructed across the empire, alongside rest houses along major roads for travelers, an infrastructure investment in public welfare that had few parallels anywhere in the medieval world at that scale. Beyond the temples and hospitals, ordinary life in Angkor unfolded in ways that archaeology and contemporary accounts help us reconstruct. The Chinese diplomat Zhou Daguan visited Angkor around 1296, decades after its peak, but still during a functioning imperial capital, and left behind the only detailed eyewitness account we have from someone who actually lived there for nearly a year. He described a bustling city where markets operated without fixed stalls, women conducting most of the commerce, goods laid out on mats that could be relocated daily. He described elaborate royal processions with gold-handled parasols denoting rank, elephants adorned with gold, hundreds of palace women in elaborate dress. He described houses built on stilts to survive flooding, roofed with thatch for commoners and tile for nobility, an architectural hierarchy visible from a distance. He noted, with some surprise, that most residents bathed multiple times daily in the rivers and ponds, a level of hygiene he found notable enough to record for his Chinese readers back home. Zhou Daguan also describes something that hints at the underlying fragility beneath Angkor's grandeur: the sheer dependence on the hydraulic system's continued maintenance. Canals required constant dredging to prevent silt buildup. Reservoir walls needed continuous reinforcement against monsoon erosion. Sluice gates demanded regular repair. This wasn't a system that could be built once and forgotten. It required an unbroken chain of skilled labor, administrative oversight, and royal investment stretching across generations. And that chain, as durable as it had proven for centuries, was not indestructible. By the 13th and 14th centuries, cracks were beginning to show, though not in the sudden, visible way of a siege or a volcanic eruption. This was a slower unraveling, and historians still debate its precise causes, likely a combination of interlocking factors rather than a single catastrophe. Modern tree ring and paleoclimate research has revealed evidence of severe, prolonged droughts, interspersed with intense monsoon flooding during the 14th and 15th centuries. Climate volatility that would have placed extraordinary stress on a hydraulic system engineered for a more predictable pattern of wet and dry seasons. Sediment core samples from Angkor's canals show evidence of massive erosion and infrastructure failure during this period. Sluice gates overwhelmed, canals choked with silt faster than laborers could clear them. A system that had taken centuries to perfect began failing within the span of a few generations. At the same time, the rising kingdom of Ayutthaya, based in what is now Thailand, grew increasingly aggressive toward the weakening Khmer state, launching repeated military campaigns against Angkor through the 14th and 15th centuries. Historical records, though fragmentary and inconsistently preserved from this period, describe multiple sieges and occupations of the city. Unlike Baghdad's single catastrophic week, or Persepolis' single night of fire, Angkor's decline stretched across nearly 2 centuries of intermittent warfare, economic strain, and infrastructure collapse, each crisis compounding the last, each recovery a little less complete than before. By 1431, following another devastating siege by Ayutthayan forces, the Khmer court made the decision to formally relocate the capital southeast, eventually settling near modern Phnom Penh, closer to trade routes along the Mekong River. Angkor was not instantly abandoned. Religious use of Angkor Wat itself actually continued in some form for centuries, maintained by Buddhist monks even as the surrounding urban infrastructure crumbled into disuse. But the great hydraulic city, the urban network that had once sustained the better part of 1 million people, was left without the administrative and engineering attention it required. Without constant maintenance, the canals silted permanently. The reservoirs failed to hold water through the dry seasons. The rice surplus that had funded Angkor's grandeur for 4 centuries evaporated along with the water system that produced it. And then the jungle began its work. Cambodia's tropical climate is relentless. Strangler figs, whose seeds often germinate in the crevices of stone temples after birds deposit them there, sent roots down through masonry joints, prying apart blocks that had stood firmly for 800 years. Within a few generations, root systems the size of small trees had wrapped entirely around towers and gateways, simultaneously destroying and, in a strange paradox, structurally binding the ruins together. Removing the roots today would collapse structures the trees themselves had partially cracked apart. Vegetation reclaimed causeways, silt filled moats until they became marshland. The city that had once housed the largest population centre in the pre-industrial world became, over the span of a few centuries, indistinguishable from surrounding forest to anyone who didn't already know where to look. Angkor never fully vanished from local memory. Cambodian villagers continued to live near and venerate certain temples, and Buddhist monks maintained a presence at Angkor Wat continuously. But the scale of what had existed, the vast interconnected urban network beyond the temples themselves, faded from broader awareness. It took French naturalist Henri Mouot's widely publicised 1860 account, though he was far from the first Westerner to see the ruins, to bring global attention to Angkor's scale, describing Angkor Wat as rivaling the grandest monuments of Solomon or Michelangelo. Since then, decades of archaeological work, and more recently, LiDAR aerial surveys conducted in 2012 and beyond, have revealed the true scope of what lay hidden beneath the jungle canopy. Not just the famous temples tourists visit today, but an entire lost city of canals, roads, and residential neighborhoods, extending far beyond what anyone had previously mapped, confirming Angkor's status as almost certainly the largest urban settlement on Earth prior to the industrial age. What does Angkor's slow disappearance teach us? Unlike London's plague, Persepolis's fire, or Baghdad's massacre, Angkor wasn't destroyed in a single dramatic moment. It reveals a different kind of vulnerability, the fragility of complex systems that depend on continuous maintenance rather than one-time construction. Angkor's genius was hydraulic engineering, sophisticated enough to sustain 750,000 people through Cambodia's harshest seasonal extremes. But that same sophistication became a liability the moment political will, administrative capacity, or climate stability faltered. A system that magnificent, that intricate, required unbroken generations of expertise to sustain. And when war, climate volatility, and shifting trade routes disrupted that continuity, even partially, the entire structure unraveled, not overnight, but inevitably. Today, Angkor Wat remains the most visited site in Cambodia, its 5 towers appearing on the national flag itself, a symbol of enduring Khmer identity even after centuries of jungle reclamation. Walking its galleries today, past bas-reliefs of gods churning the ocean of milk, past the serene stone faces of the Bayon, watching silently over what remains of Angkor Thom, it's worth remembering that these monuments outlasted the very civilization sophisticated enough to build them. The temples survived. The water system that made the city possible in the first place did not. Angkor proved that the most advanced engineering in the pre-industrial world could sustain nearly 1 million people for 4 centuries. And Angkor proved, just as clearly, that even the most brilliant systems require someone, generation after generation, to keep the water flowing.